Good morning. This is Stormy Peters, VP of Technical Evangelism at the Cloud Foundry Foundation, bringing you the Cloud Foundry Morning Edition. Good morning and welcome to Cloud Foundry Morning Edition. So I was listening to Cloud Foundry After Dark this morning and I realized that everyone might not have an hour and a half to catch up. I mean, it's a great time to go meet the community, talk to people, but if you just want the Cliff Notes version, that's what the Cloud Foundry Morning Edition is going to be. It's going to be about a 10-minute update, summarize what they talked about as well as some other happenings, and you can always follow up with any of the things that sound interesting to you. So last week, Cloud Foundry was at LinuxCon, Open Cloud, ContainerCon in Seattle, Washington. We had a great booth. It was fun for me because we had a lot of great people working in the booth, had a lot of really good conversations. We had help from our member companies from CenturyLink, Pivotal, Blue Box Cloud, and we got questions. We got questions all over the map. We got a lot of questions that were like, what is it? Those people mostly wanted a t-shirt, but they learned a little bit about Cloud Foundry in the process. But then we also got some really great questions from people like big companies that were thinking about using Cloud Foundry and had obviously played around with it and had some really specific questions about how it was working or how they could use it differently. And then to my excitement, we even got questions like, can I help with a doc sprint? So if you'd like to help with a doc sprint, let me know. We also had some really good speakers. We had a couple of keynotes about Cloud Foundry. Sam Ramji, the CEO of Cloud Foundry Foundation, gave a keynote. He continued along his line of thinking from the OSCON keynote, so more about prescriptive versus putting it all together yourself and what that means in the space and how foundations play in it. Then Duncan Johnston-Watt from CloudSoft also gave a keynote another day. And then a number of our member companies gave keynotes on different aspects, different technical aspects of Cloud Foundry. David Persing from Nabari Software gave a talk, and I really liked his talk because it was pretty much like, when can I get back to coding? And he talked about how adopting Cloud Foundry had enabled his organization to move from like maintaining the infrastructure and from him having to respond at 3 a.m. and figure out why things weren't working to an environment where all of his developers could focus on code again. And he talked about that transition to 12-factor apps and microservices. It was just kind of fun. And Chris Sterling from CenturyLink gave a couple of talks. He talked about configuration management, and then he talked about the lean method and using the lean startup method on Cloud Foundry and on platform as a service in general. And then a couple talks from Pivotal folks. So Ramiro Salas spoke about Cloud Foundry at OpenStack, which is, I don't want to say hot topic, but highly requested topic these days. And then David Soul from Pivotal also talked about containers and how containers work in Cloud Foundry. There were a lot of talks on containers, so it was interesting to see how Cloud Foundry manages those and how we approach that. So that's what we were doing up in Seattle. You'll next see us in Berlin. So beginning of November, we'll be at the Berlin Summit. Right now is the time to submit a talk, so if you'd like to join us, please submit a talk. And after that, we'll be in China for the Cloud Foundry Summit there. So moving on, I was going to sneak in an evangelism update here because I focus a lot on that at Cloud Foundry. So we are planning a doc sprint for September 30th. There's actually been quite a bit of interest in it. I have funding to bring a number of people to our offices in San Francisco. And I think for this first one, we'll focus on getting started with Cloud Foundry. There's some good documentation that's already there, but I would like to really make it bulletproof because I think, and I'll talk about it a little later, when people get started with Cloud Foundry, the first thing they do is download it, install it themselves. Even if they decide to go with a provider like IBM or Pivotal later, they always want to install it first. So I want to make that process really awesome. And we need everything from people who've never used or have used it a little bit who want to install it and make sure that, see how it flows, to good doc writers, to people who are familiar with Cloud Foundry and actually develop on it. So we need the whole gamut, so if you'd like to come, please let me know. We're also going to announce today or tomorrow probably that we're providing travel for meetups. When I started this job, I know meetups are important, and I thought what meetups would need is funding for pizza and a place to meet. It turns out most of them have a place to meet. Most of them have pizza and beer, although they might always need more pizza. But what they really need is speakers. So we're providing some process and some travel funds to move speakers from one place to the next. So if you speak on Cloud Foundry and want to travel a little bit and talk about it, let me know or watch our blog. Other news that happened last week was Microsoft. I don't know if you knew, Microsoft is working on Cloud Foundry, contributing to the open source version. and they had their second release of Cloud Foundry on Azure, so you can check that out. In the Cloud Foundry After Dark, Pivotal said that they have a couple of customers who are putting that through its paces in a big way and really testing it out. So that's exciting to see. Speaking of Cloud Foundry After Dark, it's always every Sunday evening. You can join, and it's run by Andrew Clay Schaefer, who I knew his little ideas on Twitter long before I met him in person. And they started out with this past Sunday. I'll just give you a quick recap of it. They started out talking about events, and they talked about how Sam's keynote had evolved over time. Then they talked about the new Pivotal CEO. They didn't really say much about him, but they did mention that this release had been a good time for Pivotal to announce that they had $100 million in sales this year just from Cloud Foundry. And as Pivotal is just one of the providers, IBM and HP and others, ActiveState also release Cloud Foundry. This market is getting pretty big, so that's pretty awesome for all of us that care about open source platform as a service. With that, Pivotal has been hiring. So they hired a couple new employees who were on the call, Bridget and Jason. We also had Matt Curry from Allstate there. They're also hiring. That's why I'll skip to him. They're hiring. They don't do remote working. It didn't sound like so. They're hiring in Chicago, Arizona, Charlotte, and Ireland. And they were all talking about how it's hard to find experienced developers that are familiar with platform as a service and Cloud Foundry in particular. So it's a great skill set to be growing these days. We also had someone from Asia on the call. I believe that was Matt Curry, actually. And they're talking about how things might be different for Cloud Foundry users in Asia, which was interesting to me because with Cloud Foundry Berlin Summit, with the summit coming up in Berlin, I'd had this conversation with Europe, and they also thought that. But then when everyone tells their stories, it all sounds very familiar. Like I was saying earlier, and Colin said on the Cloud Foundry After Dark, people start out by trying to build their own paths and pulling all the pieces and playing with them and really getting familiar with how a path works. And then at some point they realize that they have a team of 10 to 12 people that just maintain their own homegrown platform. I think Colin used some funny word, but they're maintaining their own homegrown thing. And then they look at Cloud Foundry and either download the whole platform and use it in-house or go with one of the service providers. So I think it's important that people can play with it, and that's one of the reasons Cloud Foundry is open source. But it's also important to have the solution packaged as a whole so that not every company in the world has to have a team of 10 to 12 people maintaining infrastructure. And then going back to that keynote idea that David Persing had, not keynote, talk that David Persing had, they can get back to writing their code and not maintaining this platform. So what else did they say? Matt Curry from Allstate had some really good points about what it's like for a company who's not in the software business to start contributing to an open source software project. And I'd love to talk more about that with him at some point, because they had questions come up like, can you trademark something that's not providing services externally? Should it be associated with the corporate brand of Allstate? Then how do you recruit people when they think you're an insurance company, but yet you want to tie it to the big brand that you already have? So he talked about how they're working on that, how they created their GitHub accounts, how they're contributing back already, how they sponsor Cloud Foundry meetups, and how they're building a brand around technology work and not just the industry that they're in. So that was really interesting, and I look forward to seeing more companies work on that. When we talked a little bit about they talked, I wasn't there, a little bit about what cloud native applications are what cloud native platforms are good for. And they're really good, obviously, for cloud native applications. They work for legacy applications, but that's not where you're going to get your value add. And they talked a bit about how a contract is born, and Cloud Foundry is prescriptive. It puts things together for you. And that's because they expect 12-factor apps to get the most value out of it. And that's because a lot of app developers have gone through a lot of pain to figure out what works really well. So Andrew talked about how there's these enabling constraints. So you have to do things the right way, and then it makes the rest of the things easy for you. And he talked about how Twitter does that with their 140 character constraints, and then you get this platform that enables conversations. They also talked about the Cloud Foundry Summits, and Colin Humphreys from Cloud Credo talked about how Cloud Credo is going to be offering training the first day of the Cloud Foundry Summit. So there'll be 3 tracks of training the day on the first day of the summit, and it's like Cloud Foundry for beginners, like from zero to hero. And then there'll be one that's like operations focused. I think they're mainly working on Bosch in that one. And then there'll be a cloud native track for developers, so moving from legacy apps to cloud native and figuring out how to refactor your app into this 12-factor format. And they'll be doing the same training at the Cloud Foundry Summit in China in early December. So Colin spoke a little bit more after that. He talked about the structured versus unstructured, the prescriptive debate, and just again said that most people play with it and then end up wanting to use something that everyone else has figured out how to put together. But he talked about how like when companies adopt a PaaS or a Cloud Foundry, it removes a constraint with deployment. So it used to be like their roadblock was actually getting their application out the door and being able to deploy it quickly and securely. And now they can deploy them with Cloud Foundry, they can deploy them quickly and securely as many times a day as they want. And so now they have to figure out how many times a day should they be deploying it and how should they be managing that, and then what's the next constraint, what's the thing that's going to hold them back next, where should they focus their energy. So I think there's a lot of good conversations that could happen in our user community around that, that would be really fun to foster. Speaking of trying Cloud Foundry, we talked a little bit about Lattice. If you haven't heard about Lattice, it's kind of a version of Cloud Foundry. It's its own product, but it runs on a laptop, so you can download it and deploy it locally. And it's kind of like a mini Cloud Foundry, and it allows you to create containers, to scale them, to schedule them, just kind of check out how things work. And the new version you can run build packs and droplets. And James Bayer talked a little bit about this. He also talked about how Lattice is a place for experimentation. So for example, the TCP routing work that GE has been helping to build is in the latest version of Lattice, and it'll be there and tried out there for a while before it goes into Cloud Foundry. So it's a place to also experiment with some of the new technologies coming out. They also had a conversation about whether PaaS is the right term. And I think it's really interesting that in the US, I hear more people trying to move to cloud native, not completely. I gave a talk last week and I asked the audience who had heard of cloud native, and not a single one of them had. And then I asked who had heard of PaaS, and they all raised their hand. But to hear more cloud native in the US, it sounds like in Europe and Asia, you haven't heard that term yet. From there, they went on to talk about whether build packs. So build packs is how Cloud Foundry recognizes it's all the information it needs to kind of, I won't say compile your app, but to run your app. So there's build packs for like Java, and there's build packs for Ruby, and build packs for the different languages. And they talked about whether or not that would help organizations maintain multiple languages, or whether it was still beneficial for organizations to try to move to a single language. And they talked a bit about Microsoft Azure that released last week, and it was interesting to me in the conversation because they talked about how Azure had features that Cloud Foundry didn't, and how we might actually build those into Cloud Foundry, or that in particular into Bosch. For example, Azure has what I call the anti-affinity feature. James was talking about it, which means that you can say, hey, all these apps that I'm listing, I want them, or microservice, I want them to run as sparse as possible, as opposed to actually saying which hardware you want it to run on. So that was kind of I wonder if as Cloud Foundry is used by more organizations and ported to more platforms, if we'll get the best of all the different PaaSes that they've created. And then they talked about VMworld that's coming up next week, and I just want to remind you that the Berlin Cloud Foundry Summit is coming up in November, and right now is the time to submit your paper. We especially would like to hear anything about how you're using Cloud Foundry, any challenges you've had, or any best practices you've developed, so that other people can learn from you. So thanks for joining me for the Cloud Foundry Morning Edition. If you enjoyed it, please let me know, and I will do it again next week. Talk to you later. Bye.